So my last guide to tradeups was quite a long time ago. I figured I would update it and talk about the new state of tradeups because a lot has changed since the last video, so I figured I'd update the guide and just have it on my channel for the foreseeable future until it needs a massive update once again. This video is basically going to cover everything you need to know about tradeups from the fundamentals up into the more advanced stuff, so tune in and let's talk about how to make some profit. The sponsor for today's video is skinwallet.com. They're a brand new site with a nice clean UI that you can use to buy a bunch of skins a lot cheaper than you can get them on the Steam community market. They have a really high Trustpilot rating, they have great prices, no hidden fees, and a great support team that can help you with any issues you might encounter, so be sure to check them out with the link in the description below. Thanks. So if you've been doing tradeups for a long time, you've probably realized that the profit margins on them have gotten a lot worse in recent months, or over the last year at least, and that's kind of caused a lot of tradeups to no longer be profitable, and you can't justify doing these tradeups anymore. Well, fret not, there is still very profitable tradeups to do, but that's going to concern new theory and old theory. So if you don't already know, there's two theories to tradeups, and that's old theory and new theory. Old theory is basically completely phased out by now. There's not really a lot of people that even believe in it anymore, but just for the sake of this video and a little bit of tradeup history, I'll explain what it was. Basically, old theory just says that the numbers are exactly as they appear. So if you have 3 items from one collection, 6 items from another collection, and 1 item from another collection, your chances are 30%, 10%, and 60%. It doesn't take into account the outcomes of the trade-up, it only takes into account the inputs. New theory is obviously basically the opposite of this, and new theory takes into account the outputs and the inputs, not just the inputs. And that's why a lot of people like to use it, and based on statistical analysis over time, it seems that new theory is true, although I don't believe there's actually a direct statement from Valve saying this, although I believe if you go to the game files you can probably figure it out. New theory is actually really good because it means you can do something called manipulating the outcomes, which is pretty popular these days and is the main source of profit for a lot of people. Take for example this trade up where you use 7 inputs from the Emerald Pinstripes and then 3 inputs from the Ancient Lores. Despite there being more Emerald Pinstripes than there are Ancient Lores, your odds are about 50-50 with new theory, which is really good, and it means that your profit margins are definitely a lot higher than if old theory was correct. So when it comes to doing these new theory trade-ups, the way you're basically going to want to do them is to find a collection that only has one outcome and then put it into something that has multiple outcomes so you can prefer the multiple outcomes over the one outcome. To simplify it a little bit, basically the collections that have multiple outcomes are more valuable when it comes to calculating the odds of the trade-up than items that only have one output. If you're doing a blue to purple trade-up, I would recommend using 5.7 Silver Quartz or MP7 Anodized Navy, whatever is cheaper, because those are going to be able to be bought for a very cheap price. They only have one outcome and they have very low floats, which means you're going to be able to manipulate the floats to your advantage as well. But we'll get into that later. If you're doing a purple to pink trade up, I would recommend the AK Emerald Pinstripe because it only has one outcome. And if you're doing a pink to red trade up, I would recommend using the P90 Cold Blooded, possibly, depending on how expensive the trade up actually is. If it's like something like a Gungnir, for example. But pink to red trade ups are going to be not as great because there's not really a lot of one outcome skins that are actually cheap enough to buy. That will still give you good profit margins. I'll put a few of my personal favorite new theory trade ups up on screen so you guys can go ahead and look at them and maybe pause the video, and if you want some more trade ups, those are going to be at the end of the video. To make this a little bit more spicy as well, I'm going to show you a couple of my attempts at new theory Broken Fang trade ups, so let's check those out. Stressful, rough relationship, okay, we have, but I still pray to you. I still pray to you, Gaben. You're my spiritual guider, and I believe in Gabenism, so you know that hopefully my faith is enough. Thanks for the bits. That's not gonna soften the blow too much.
1 bit.
If you get it, I get $10. I gave you a prayer. Okay, the 1-bit prayer, boys. Okay, whoo, that's good. That's good. That's good. Shortly after the stream that clip is from, I actually attempted it again with even less inputs from Broken Fang, and I was actually able to hit the Pantera Anka, so that was really cool. Overall, new theory is probably the primary way to make money off of trade-ups these days, so go ahead and try it out if you're feeling a little bit lucky, and if you want to go ahead and use a trade-up simulator to calculate your odds, I'll actually have a few of those listed at the end of the video. The other two primary methods of making money off of trade-ups is going to be 50-50s and 33% trade-ups. 50-50s are pretty cool because you can get a nice red item usually, or a pink item if you choose to do it that way, and these trade-ups are also going to be able to make you quite a lot of money if you're lucky on them, but they're going to be a little bit less profit than if you were to do a new theory trade-up instead. These trade-ups are pretty straightforward, so if you want to go ahead and check out some of them that I listed on screen that are more popular, that's going to be a pretty good option. And there's also going to be blue to purple trade-ups. These ones are a 1 in 5 usually, but for the Prisma case, for example, that one actually has 2 outcomes that are pretty good, so these 1 in 5 trade-ups are usually pretty popular as well, and they come around whenever there's a pretty good purple in a case, like the recent op exoskeleton. So overall, that kind of covers all of the methods right now that are used to make profit off of tradeups. There is one more, and it's basically just where you mix a bunch of pinks together and hope that you get the better reds out of them. And I'll put up a couple examples of it, but mainly there's not really any rhyme or reason to it. It's just looking into the floats and calculating all of the values that you're going to have, and that one's a little bit more tedious, but it will be pretty profitable if you're lucky. So that's basically every single method of profit for the current trade up scene, and now let's move into looking at some websites and talking about float averaging like I mentioned before, and a few other little miscellaneous things about trade ups. So let's talk about some trade up simulator websites. This is basically websites that you can go to figure out the odds of a trade up. If you put in certain inputs and certain floats, you'll figure out what the average float outcome is, and basically how much profit you can make and what kind of skins you could get, and also the percentages for them. So these are pretty useful sites. Now the first site we're going to talk about is the one that's been used for a very long time, and that's Csgo Exchange's Trade Up Simulator. So this is a pretty good one, but it is pretty slow and a little bit laggy. It does have old and new theory though, which a lot of sites don't have, so if you want to calculate some old theory odds for whatever reason, you can use that site. I'll have a link to it in the description below. Now the trade up site that I personally prefer is going to be Float Markets Trade Up Simulator. This one's pretty fast, it has a very easy to use UI, and it has the EV, which is basically just the value of profit that you're essentially going to make by each average trade up. And it also has, of course, the odds and all of that sort of thing. It's a pretty good one. Overall, I think it's the best trade-up simulator out there, and there will also be a link below. The next trade-up simulator is one that is pretty unpopular based on a poll that I ran on Twitter recently, and this one is Buff's trade-up simulator. So Buff does actually have a trade-up simulator, but a lot of people think it's just way too slow and definitely not worth using. So maybe in the future, if they update it, it could be. Maybe you can check it out, though, and see if it works better for your browser. And the final trade-up site that people use is TradeUp Spy. This one is pretty much on the same level as Float Markets, where a lot of people do enjoy this one and think it's one of the better ones out there, so you can go ahead and use them. I've used them before as well, and they do have a very nice UI. The site overall I feel is a little bit confusing, but I do think it's a pretty good trade-up simulator, so that'll also have a link in the description below. Personally, the two that I primarily use are Csgo Exchange and Float Market Trade-Up Simulator, but feel free to explore them and see which one works best for you. If you're doing a lot of trade-ups and a lot of different ones at one time, it can be nice to have a good simulator so you can calculate all of the odds. There's also a few websites that calculate the profit from each trade-up and can give you some pretty good ones to try out, but unfortunately the vast majority of them are pretty outdated by now. The only one that I would recommend checking up on is probably TradeUp Hero. Most of the other sites seem to be abandoned by this point. Alright, now on to float averaging. So float averaging is basically how the TradeUp calculates the float of the item that you're going to get as an output, and this is a fairly complicated process, but because of the simulator websites, it's actually not that hard at all. All you really have to do is put in your inputs and see what the average float is going to be for the items. Now keep in mind that not every TradeUp is going to be equal. For example, if an item has a 0.06 float cap in factory new condition, it's going to be a lot harder to get it in factory new, and your floats for the inputs are going to have to be a lot lower if you actually want to get that item in factory new. Otherwise, it's going to calculate and make your output a minimal wear, which can lose you a significant amount of money. If you're doing a trade-up that deals with float caps and you're concerned about what the output could be, just use a trade-up simulator and it'll be able to figure out what the item's float is actually going to be with the given inputted floats. So overall, it's not anything complicated here. It seems a little bit complicated in terms of the math, but it's not really something that you have to personally worry about because of the trade-up simulators, and it's just averaging the float. So all it's doing is taking the average float of the inputs and then giving you that as the output, as long as the output is a normal item with no float cap. The final thing I wanted to do is just talk about finding good trade-ups and also talking about some trade-ups that I personally use and can be pretty profitable. So starting off with finding good trade-ups, there's a lot of ways that you can do this. Again, you can use different websites and check which ones are updated. TradeUp Hero, again, is probably the one that is going to be most likely updated, but a lot of the other websites from the past are pretty much defunct by now, so you're going to have to rely on that if you're looking for a website. The other thing you can do is just simply going to Csgo Stash and figuring out what the profitable margins are on each item. That's what I usually do. So for example, if I want to do like a 33% pink trade up, I'll look around and find something like the Shadow case where I can trade up for a AK frontside Misty and get a pretty good profit margin on that. Also, don't just limit yourself to only the cases. You can also go into the collections tab on Csgo Stash, and there's a wide variety of collections that also have profitable margins. Like for example, the earlier trade up I showed you with the Pantera Anka, which has about a double profit margin. It is a pretty risky trade up, of course, but if you do hit it, it's going to bring you a lot of profit. Overall, that's pretty much all there is to cover on trade ups and how to make them profitable. At the beginning of the video, I showed you guys how to do new theory and old theory trade ups and how they kind of work fundamentally. I also showed you some different trade up odds that you can do with 33% pink trade ups or 50% red trade ups, and I also showed you, of course, the emerald pinstripes and manipulating your outcomes by using the new theory. Then I also showed you guys after that how to do float averaging, some websites that you can use to find trade-ups, and then I also showed you a few of my personal favorite trade-ups. So I think it's a pretty good overall guide, and if you guys enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for all of the best investment, trade-up, and trading tips on all of YouTube. There's also Discord, Twitter, and Skin Wallet links below if you guys want to check out those for my channel and for Skin Wallet, so be sure to use those if you're interested. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.